The classic Universal monster films horror pictures are Dracula from 1931 starring Bela Lugosi, quite iconically, the 1931 Frankenstein film, extremely famously starring Boris Karloff, The Mummy from 1932, which also starred Boris Karloff as the resurrected mummy, the ancient Egyptian high priest Imhotep, who has returned to the present to seek a reincarnation of his long lost love, and behaves a lot more like Dracula than a rampaging mute mummy thug as we might imagine from an old mummy horror film. We'd be thinking rather of the 1959 Hammer film of the Mummy, actually. You then have the absolute masterpiece that is Bride of Frankenstein, not only the absolute best from this set of films, but truly one of the greatest films of all time. You really do have to see it to believe it. You see the 1935 film of Werewolf of London placed in there sometimes, which is not inapt. It is a fairly strong film, and it was a Universal film, so although it is definitely overshadowed by the next werewolf film they would put out, the wholly famous 1941 film of The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. as the iconic character. The other, though released a bit later, classic Universal monster slash horror film is the 1954 Tour de Force, which is The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which, if you allow it to be, is one of the greater films ever made, in my view. The Wolfman from 1941 would go on to become the most influential of werewolf films until the 1981 release of An American Werewolf in London, we might assume. Far more so than the 1935 film of the just aforementioned Werewolf of London, and 1941's Wolfman would prove to be an overall even stronger film, we or I could argue anyway. It is a stirring work of visceral cinematography, ruthless, merciless, existentially charged quasi-nihilism, loud engaging performances and some vivid staging, and even a maybe potential masterpiece, only possibly let down by some moments of depicting motion which can feel stiff compared with films which will come out later in history. We could claim that The Wolfman was trying to do so much for its era that the technological apparatus, we could say the techno-aesthetic, of the times could not truly contain or articulate its large imaginative ambitions. It is a film with gallant, absorbing cinematography, and yet not the most smooth, graceful direction to display and engineer all of that enrapturing cinematography. George Waggner, the film's director, was frankly not the most prolific or overly experienced individual who could have possibly helmed this film, but he does a really good job in most respects, I will claim, if nothing else. It is Joseph Valentine, the credited cinematographer, as the more impressive film credits, certainly after having shot The Wolfman. He went on to shoot the Alfred Hitchcock film Saboteur, the major celebrated classic Shadow of a Doubt, potentially one of Hitchcock's 10 greatest films of all, and Rope, the first colour film which Hitchcock would direct, as well as shooting the 1948 film on Joan of Arc, which would be directed by Victor Fleming, starring Ingrid Bergman, a visceral Technicolor undertaking which may not be ultimately the most celebrated of the films about Joan of Arc, but quite potentially one of the three best of those films. They also include films by major auteurs of world cinema, like, obviously most famously, Mr. Carl Theodor Dreyer, who helmed the 1928 silent classic masterwork titled The Passion of Joan of Arc, what all the subsequent Joan of Arc-related films aspire to be like, or to somehow match, and still today the most celebrated of all films on this subject. For you also have films from the likes of Roberto Rossellini, Otto Preminger, Robert Bresson, Jacques Rivette, and Bruno Dumont to then compete with. I love the idea of werewolf films, and I'm fond of many werewolf films from the 20th century, and some beyond that too, actually. Whilst the earlier werewolf films, prior to the 1941 release of this film, The Wolfman, certainly set some precedent, the 1925 silent film known as Wolf Blood, which I need to see more of really, as well as the earlier mentioned film Werewolf of London, which was released in 1935, it was The Wolfman which most clearly set a template for the feature films which would be released going forward. Over the decades, you would have films like The Werewolf from 1956, The House of Terror of 1960, Werewolf in a Girl's Dormitory of 1961, The Curse of the Werewolf from 1961, the Hammer film, an unbelievable masterpiece and a strong candidate for the very greatest werewolf film of all time, Face of the Screaming Werewolf of 64, La Loba 65, that Paul Naschy cycle of Spanish feature films, which is not worth getting into today, though there is plenty of them, like 13 of them even. So many silly yet kind of glorious werewolf bashes starring that guy, Mr. Naschy. Werewolves on Wheels 71, Werewolf of Washington 73, Boy Who Cried Werewolf 73, The Beast Must Die 74, Legend of the Werewolf 75, Nazarene Cross and the Wolf 75, Wolfen 1981, Howling 81, An American Werewolf in London 1981, obviously, The Beast Within 82, The Company of Wolves 1984. This is a masterpiece, if any of these films are masterpieces. One of the very greatest films ever made, I could even say. Silver Bullet 85, that's of the 20th century at least. And then in the 21st century you have Dog Soldiers, Wolf Cop, Late Phases, Lycan, and The New Wolfman from this year, 2025. Was not bad either, from what I saw of it anyway. I've talked enough about werewolves or werewolf movies today. It might be better to talk about something else now, really.